right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And of course, to our author of the month, Nancy, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much for reading. I'm thrilled. I love speaking with people. I rarely get to do this where I get to speak with people who've finished the book, and that's always a lot of fun.
Well, we have all the spoilers, the spoiler.
Yes, I know.
If you haven't finished the book, maybe we'll tell you if we really talk about something that's going to ruin it for anybody. But I do have a biography. It is the world's shortest biography, but I will read it and then we'll let you expand on it yourself. So, and I'm gonna mispronounce your last name or it's your middle name?
It's my middle name, yeah.
Can you pronounce it for me before I try?
It's Jooyoun, so it's Nancy Jooyoun Kim.
Okay. Nancy Jooyoun Kim is the New York Times best-selling author of The Last Story of Mina Lee, a Reese's Book Club pick. Her writing has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, and I'm not even going to pronounce this right. I don't even know how to say that word.
That's okay.
Okay.
We're good. No worries.
Literally can't figure out how to wrap my head around the word. NPR and PRI's selected shorts, Salon, Asian America's Writers Workshops, The Margins, and elsewhere. Born and raised in Los Angeles, she now lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here. I love talking about this book.
So I guess the most relevant question is sort of like, what was this journey for you? So this is your debut novelist. How did you get to not only like where you are as an author, having published this book, but having written this specific story?
That's a great question. I mean, I've been writing my entire life in some form or another. Whether when I was a kid, I was drawing little comics and cartoons and sort of finding ways to sort of tell stories, thinking about characters, themes. I've always been an avid reader. I was one of those kids who would kind of be, I could sit still in a corner and read for like 10 hours. So I've always been very comfortable sitting still, which is, I think, one of the prerequisites for being an author and also a person who really loves books, right? I mean, it helps to be able to do that. So it really started for me. I started, off as a very bad poet as a child, and I was never particularly good at it, but I was very passionate about it. And in college, I started taking courses in Asian American studies, and I started reading Asian American literature for the first time in my life. And I began to see how this world that I had been inhabiting growing up in a single parent, I had a single mother, and I grew up right outside of Los Angeles' Koreatown, which to me never seemed like a place that people would be interested in or that people would connect with. I suddenly began to read representations of places that were similar to what I had known growing up, and started seeing the value in sort of sharing that story in order to connect with not only people who might not be familiar with that world, but to connect with others who live that world as well, and who might be yearning to see themselves represented on the page, or yearning to feel even just less alone in the world in a very particular kind of experience. And so I went to grad school. I was primarily working on short stories at the time. I had a short story that had this character, Margot, and it was about her in this office romance. And I was really this short story haunted me. And it was because I couldn't quite figure out what I was trying to say. And I realized this romance was a way of her to avoid thinking about the sort of tensions and the complications of her relationship with her mother, because she, like the character in the novel, had moved to Seattle to go to school in order to sort of run away from her family, her past, her identity, and to sort of carve a new life for herself. But she couldn't quite get rid of her life with her mother. And she had these very complicated feelings towards her, where she loved her. And in many ways, she needed her to be there, to exist, to sort of serve as like a placeholder for her childhood and her past. But at the same time, she couldn't quite imagine how to live a modern kind of contemporary and successful life with her mother as a large part of it. And so she has, as I was thinking about this story, and I, at that time had gone through I had lost my father very suddenly in a car accident. And so I became very interested in sudden loss and how that kind of spins your sense of reality, and can do that within minutes, basically, right? I had myself, experienced the sudden loss at the same time that I was moving to Seattle from Los Angeles. And I realized that if I were to lose my mother one day, I wouldn't be able to reach her in time to save her. And so I wanted to kind of unpack this very complicated emotional space of being a daughter who loves my mother, honors my mother in so many ways, but doesn't quite know how to sort of navigate a world that doesn't recognize her, and a world that doesn't recognize the complications of the relationship between this mother and daughter. And so that was, the sort of beginning of my novel, is imagining this conversation, this impossible conversation, conversation between a mother and daughter that doesn't really exist in real life because she's dead in the beginning of the story, and how the past and the present, the mother and the daughter, kind of speak to each other through this narrative. And it's like this, so structured in that way. And that really took me about 9 years or so, 8 to 9 years to develop and work on, because I was working full-time jobs. I worked in communications for employment services for people with disabilities. I worked in PR. I've done just a variety of different jobs because I've always had bills to pay. And so writing a novel was something I either did, during breaks or on the weekends. And it took me a really long time for that reason. But I'm grateful for, I think I also very much grew as a human being during that period of time, which is really important to this book.
Well, the good news is you're very good at it, so you should continue doing it.
I hope so. I mean, that's the only reason. I mean, that's why I write, just so I can keep writing, Yeah, I mean, I just love being in this space, and I love being in the world of making new things.
Well, this book is so interesting because the genre, like, it's not one genre. I mean, it's a roller coaster of family drama. You have your thrill, your whodunit type element to it, and you also have your sort of like women's literature like thrown in there as well. So so many of our members said like that's why they enjoyed it so much, is because it was a little bit of everything.
Yeah, and I like this idea of creatively kind of playing with genre and the expectations of the reader. And the novel is called The Last Story of Mina because it's very much a novel about storytelling, and the stories we tell and the stories that we choose not to tell for a lot of reasons. And I'm sure we'll be unpacking that, talking about that tonight, because I know people are I bet are curious about why didn't somebody say this, or why didn't, we're all kind of curious about those things. But when we think about it, a lot of our lives are a lot of my interior space going through life, having a husband and a daughter myself, is thinking about how I'm going to share things with people. Whether it's like sharing things about my life, whether it's about sharing, my feelings about something, or what I really want to be doing over summer break, I mean, so much of our mental energy is actually dedicated towards figuring out how to have conversations that on the outside shouldn't be difficult, but are very difficult for various reasons, because we're kind of asking to either share our needs, or we're asking to be seen in ways that we're not seen in real life. And so for me, incorporating all of these genres is a kind of play upon different tools and like forms of narrative that we can use to sort of tell a story that might be very difficult to tell.
So the book is fiction, but it does have some similarities. I mean, we have to draw from something. So there are some similarities with your own life.
Yes, the book is not autobiographical in the sense that nothing that happens in it actually happened, and none of the characters are explicitly based upon anyone that I know. I kind of avoided all of that for personal reasons, because I really wanted it to be fiction in that sense. But it draws from my personal life in the sense that as a American-born daughter of a single mother, a Korean immigrant, There are certain experiences, certain difficulties that I had growing up, whether it was the language difference between me and my mother, which actually exists to this day. I still use Google Translate to sometimes have, conversations with my mom that I don't know how to say in Korean. And then she replies back to me in Korean over text, and then I translate it into English. And so these types of differences in language, I think unless you experience it firsthand, are often very difficult to describe and understand. And it's like, well, how do you go through life? I mean, as a child growing up, your interactions with your parents can often be very restricted to, what did you eat? Where are you going? It's hot outside, put on, take off that jacket, So all of those things I can, yes, exactly. All of those things I can say in Korean. But then when it comes to adult stuff, like, why did you immigrate to this country? She's not going to be able to explain that to me. Right. So a lot of our lives have been, and I've written essays in the past, and I've put it through Google Translate. This is like a plug for Google unintentionally, but I put it through Google Translate. And my mom will, and if you've ever used these translation services, my mom will like read this really haphazardly translated document in an attempt to understand me, like pouring my heart out on paper. But it continues to be a conflict. People say like, oh, why don't you just learn the language, or why don't they just learn the language? It's a lot harder than it if you've ever tried to actually learn a foreign language and to be fluent and to retain it. It's tough. Yeah.
So we actually, sorry, I should mention, ladies, if anybody wants to ask a question, you're absolutely welcome to. We do have the chat window where you can put your question, and I'll make sure that it gets asked. Or even more fun is the raise your hand functionality, where you can ask the question live to Nancy. If you'd like to do that, please feel free. Yeah. I did have a question emailed into me from Sarah, and I don't know if Sarah's here or not, but she wanted to, I don't see her. She wanted to make sure I asked it. So she said she was surprised that Margot didn't learn, while we're talking about languages, I figured I might as well bring this one up. She was surprised that Margot didn't learn Korean simply by living in a single parent home with someone who spoke Korean. It seems like a baby or toddler, with most of her exposure being only to her mother, would have learned the language. Can you discuss the role language played in the story and as a barrier between Mina and Margot?
Yeah, as I sort of mentioned earlier, I think of it as, this story is structured as this kind of impossible conversation between a mother and a daughter who don't speak the same language. And I mean literal language, like, Margot speaks a little Korean, Mina speaks a little bit of English. So there's that literal language barrier, but also there's the barrier between generations, between two cultures, between different conceptions of what a mother should be sharing with her daughter. She, I think Mina, to a certain extent, doesn't want to share a lot of her interactions of her adult life, possibly out of shame, out of a desire to protect her daughter and her feelings. So, I mean, I think that there's, a lot of layers to why they don't speak the same language. But in terms of, how this could technically happen, is I grew up in a household that is in a sense dual language. I also, as a toddler, I am sure heard my mother speak Korean. And so, but because of this sort of the way our country works and my interactions growing up, my primary conversational partners were in English. And I learned very early on that in order to fit in and to succeed and to do well in school, I would want to be completely fluent in English, and I wouldn't want to have an accent, and I would learn to sort of dissociate myself from the language itself. I think I would have learned Korean if I had more family in this country, because I would have had more partners to exchange the languages. I also think that's really important, especially a language like Korean, which actually requires different tenses for the different types of people that you're speaking with, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so because I only had my mother and we had this very casual, informal relationship and a toddler level relationship to a certain extent, if I were to go to Korea now, I would sound extremely rude in all of if I tried to speak Korean, right? Because it's like everything would be so informal. It would be like so like elementary, so basic. And so I feel as if Margot, in this sense, she has a mother who works all day long, who has probably a very limited scope of the language that she's exposed to, which is primarily that transactional language that happens between parents and children. And she lives in a world that doesn't prioritize the language that the language of the home. And I think that's a very common experience to a lot of kids. It's less so now, but I remember when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, Korean is kind of everywhere now, right? I mean, because of the cultural kind of expansion and all of that. But, when I was growing up, there wasn't really a lot of Korean outside of Koreatown. And so you're taught as a child that, to be successful, and I don't actually believe this, you'd have to kind of graduate past where you grow up.
Right.
You'd have to kind of leave Koreatown. And for Margot, that also means abandoning her language, abandoning her culture so that she can assimilate in a stronger way. But ultimately, she is left adrift because she doesn't have her mother. And her mother, who is might not be the best mother in the world, is also a source of strength and a kind of could have been a source of inspiration for Margot too. Mm-hmm. But they hadn't shared those two things together. And she only had these really particular kind of negative associations with her mom, which is really unfortunate because she never knows, while her mother is living, she never knows the Mina that we all know and love. Yeah. She never kind of falls in love with that character the way we do. Yeah. And so I think that is sometimes gets lost, this idea of, I think the reader kind of falls for Mina and her narrative, but we see Mina and feel Mina much more deeply than Margot can even. She only gets like the tip of the iceberg by putting together all of these details. And so it's up to her at the end of the book, and we can talk about that later, to see how far she's going to take all of this.
Well, yeah, she doesn't even realize about her losing her husband and her child. Like that has to be such a key component to who she is.
Yeah, exactly. And then your empathy for her and why she came to this country, I think you realize, we see our parents in these ways that they present to us, because I think they present themselves that way because that's how they feel like they have to, And so when you see your parents as these imperfect, flawed people who might have been dreamers just like you, growing up, and might have fallen in love and maybe that didn't work out, and, have very complex reasons for why they do what they do. And Margot only has the opportunity to connect with that, unfortunately, after her mother dies, which I actually think is somewhat of a common narrative, in the sense that, like, my father, I had such a different understanding of him once he died, you know, and I'm grateful for that. I don't necessarily feel like, oh, if only I had known that while he was alive, because I know that there were certain reasons for himself that he needed to protect himself. He couldn't explain certain things to me. Mm-hmm. And I kind of, in the end, feel as if I have to honor that, I mean, that's how he got through this world, and it was difficult for him. So.
Jill's just written here that she thought the language thread between this month's book and last month's book was so similar. So we actually read Speak Okinawa last month. I don't know if you're familiar with that book.
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Right. So it's a memoir. So it's actually very different, but there is a very strong narrative about a mother and a daughter. And so there are some similarities. But she said that one of the most moving aspects of both books for her. So.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's fascinating. As I have a toddler myself. So it's fascinating to think of all this language stuff and the things that people are saying regarding like language and how they learn language and how they learn to speak, how we learn to speak to ourselves through how we speak to our children, so this is all kind of, it's fascinating. You kind of see how language development happens at that age and how it can get lost, so.
So Ashna has written here, in the book, there are so many moments around food. Can you tell us more about those?
That's a great question. Everybody loves the food in this book. It's so fascinating because it was intentional in the sense that it's part of the story to convey a certain amount of like memory making that occurs through food, and the way that food is not only a sort of immediate sort of it recalls memories and feelings so immediately, but it's also a way of like communicating culture, right? In the sense that, you know, if Margot had been paying attention a little bit more, she would have learned actually a lot of Korean culture by sort of thinking about, you know, how meals are shared within the culture, how the way a table is arranged is a kind of presentation, and then it's almost, there's like a almost political or even sentimental aspect to all of this, you know, and it kind of shares the sort of values of the culture in a lot of ways. And so for me, food is, and I think a lot for pretty much, you know, I want to say for every culture on earth, it's that thing that we all get together around. It's that thing that speaks for us, and that has, you know, generations have used to sort of speak histories, you know, to us, in the sense that, you know, we think of ingredients and what was available, and, you know, we think of kimchi or various preserves that come from different countries, and how people got through hard times through their like ingenuity, their creativity, and their desire to eat good things, you know. And I think that's a very universal thing. Particularly in my family, you know, food was always my mother. You know, I think food was her primary way of telling me how much she was thinking about me. So she was always very concerned about, you know, what did you eat for dinner? You know, that's kind of like your way of saying, how are you? You know, instead of like, what are you, you know, and we live in a much more feelings oriented society, but, you know, instead of saying like, what did you feel? It's more of like, what did you eat for dinner? And it's kind of an indication of like the kind of day that you're having, you know. Like, oh, and it's also an opportunity to open up a sort of story about yourself and your day, you know. Like it, because it could be, you know, I had to throw together this, you know, I just microwaved a pizza, or I baked a pizza or whatever, because I was so busy today. I had this and this going on, but it's almost like a conversation opener.
Totally.
Yeah. And I do feel like that's kind of, you know, I mean, people sometimes ask questions about whether these things are culturally specific, but I do find that many cultures, or even if all of them around the world, have some sort of very sacred relationship to food and things that evoke certain things for them, whether it's holidays, you know, Sunday evening meals, very specific foods. And that, you know, one of the ways of being close to someone is by sharing food with them. So
definitely. So we have a question here. Why does she call Mr. Kim Mr. even though they are dating? Is there a cultural component to it?
Yeah, there is. And I don't know if this is specifically Korean American or Korean itself. I don't think it's, I feel like it's some sort of Korean American like adaptation to sort of English, you know, like a sort of forms of formality, because my mother growing up, you know, has always referred to people through their titles as opposed to their first names. So like my mom's best friend, she has always been referred to as Steve's mom. So I don't know who my mom's best friend is. Like I literally have no idea what her first name is, because my mom always says, Steve's mom and I are going somewhere today. You know what I mean? Or Steve's mom and I are going to, you know, meet up for dinner. And I'm like, Steve's mom, okay, your best friend, you know? And so things like Mr., Mrs., this person's mom, Margot's mom, you know, all of those, that type of more like formal way of communicating is a very common, at least in the Korean American community. So I feel like in Korea, there are a lot of kind of formal titles of respect that are used. So that's almost like a kind of Americanized version of those formal titles. Yeah.
All right. Why didn't Mina tell Margot who her father was? And I guess this is all, I mean, you might have a formal answer, or you might have to just project what you think happened, or maybe you don't have an answer at all, because some of these questions want to know that like beyond the book. So
yeah, I mean, I'd be curious if anybody here has any guesses.
And does anybody have any guesses about why didn't Mina tell Margot who her father was? And if you want to leave it for a second, we can go to the next question and see if anybody has an answer to that one.
Yeah, I mean, or you can even answer in the comment box, you know, like what what your guesses are. I mean, I have my answer, but I think that it'd be interesting to see what people think.
Totally.
I mean, most of these, one would think, yeah, so we'll see what people.
Well, here they already come anyways. Desiree says, my guess is because he was married.
Okay. Any other guesses?
Oh, Ren wants to answer live.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I thought I'd answer live. If my cat jumps up, that's why I've had my camera on. So I thought it was shame. I thought it was due to shame that he left her pregnant. And also she felt like she was almost cheating on her dead husband in a way. And so you talked about how in the book, you talked about how women who were single were seen as having failed, not having a full family, trying to make it on their own, and they weren't recognized by the community for their strength, their tenacity, their capacity to actually do it by themselves with one income and raising children. That's my thought.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other ones?
So Ashna says she was trying to protect Margot from trauma she went through herself.
So, I mean, for me, I would say that those all sound correct. I think that the reasons are very complicated, but definitely shame is one of the kind of driving force behind a lot of the secrecy in this book. It even is, I would say, part of why Mrs. Beck never spoke about her past. Because I think that we live in a culture, unfortunately, that shames people who fall victim to either the circumstances of their lives or victims to very specific people. There's a kind of shame base to that, and I think women in particular encounter that when it is in regards to their sexuality, right? Like it's sort of like women are judged for their relationships to either be by their relationships with men, by the way they allow themselves to be treated by men, and so a lot of this story is about, how shame creates these sort of silos around these individuals and has those silences have repercussions that lead to places that none of these people could have quite anticipated, I mean, it would have been such a different story if these women could have shared what had happened to them. Right? I mean, it's sort of fascinating to think how it seems like it's so easy, but then at the same time, we could see how difficult these stories are to share. And there are reasons why we don't, and there isn't a lot of space for them in everyday life to talk about. So.
Jill actually has a question she would like to ask live.
Hi, this sort of goes with the topic of why she didn't tell Margot, why Mina didn't tell Margot, but I almost found it equally as frustrating / maybe more frustrating that she didn't tell Mr. Kim about Margot. And then I added my other component regarding in the chat just about I wish toward the end of the book, he had given her a better explanation about Vegas, because I thought that Mina did intend to introduce them and bring them together and make them part of their lives at that juncture in her life. So I thought it was interesting that later she decided not to proceed with what I thought to be her plan during Margot's childhood.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he is definitely a frustrating character in the sense that there are certain things that we do not understand. A lot of, I had always imagined that there were very practical reasons why he ended up being the person that he was. I had always also imagined that despite his undocumented status and, for his reasons, that he had other reasons for fleeing that are never quite explained within the book, and that he was, possibly loved his wife, but was in a marriage of convenience for him. and that he, for whatever reason, specifically, he was derailed in his ability to meet Mina, and therefore Mina was extra ashamed of the effort that she had probably put into trying to connect with him again. I mean, do we forgive him at the end? Does he do enough? I mean, that's kind of the interesting thing to think about, you know? Do you? I mean, do you feel, Jill, do you? You know, it seems like you have such, you know, strong feelings about his kind of suckiness at various times, and it is upsetting. But at the same time, his behaviors allowed for the kind of trajectory of this story to unfold in a way that I felt was necessary, you know. And I mean, I'm curious if people felt like he was redeemed, if people liked him at all at the end, or if they felt like he didn't do enough, and like if only he could have, you know, reached out earlier. There could have been ways he should have found her, even though he didn't know that there was a child, right? So in his mind, he could have also assumed maybe that this is for the best.
I was going to say, I almost am a little sadistic in the fact that I wish she had told him so he could like wallow in that fact.
Oh.
Like, because he ended up living life and being terminally ill and never had a child of his own. And I think like for a lot of people, especially when they're facing mortality, start to grieve maybe not having offspring and things like that. So like I almost wanted her to tell him A, so he could know, and B, so he could have, I don't know, maybe appreciated the regret of his decision. So I don't know, maybe he wouldn't have been, I don't know.
That's complicated. I mean, I think she made the choice as an attempt to protect him, because she didn't quite understand what would be the point of telling him at this phase in his life. And yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, this is a woman who carries a lot. Whether or not she needed to is like a different thing. She clearly needed to in order to survive and to sort of endure and get through the things that she had survived in her life. But to think about, you know, for myself as an author, I have to feel a certain amount of peace with the characters at the end of the book. And so for me, I felt at peace with him and his performance at the end and his, you know, his usefulness at the end. But, you know, I think every reader will have a different experience of this. And some of this is colored by, you know, how much you identify with which character and who you're rooting for and who you feel like was wrong and deserve to have more redemption, you know? Yeah.
Thanks, Jill, for your question.
That was great. Yeah, thank you.
Ren actually has another one, which is great.
So I found Mr. Kim was pragmatic. Like, in a way, it seemed like the women in the book almost didn't move on from the men. Meanwhile, he moved to Chicago. Mm-hmm. He did what he said he was going to do. He opened the grocery stores. He married. I don't know if we found out how long he had been married. I don't remember that, if it was in the book. But I found him to be a pragmatic character, mm-hmm. and I was sympathetic to him, I would say.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, and even, I mean, when you think about it, the gun in the novel has a very pragmatic, you know, right? I mean, that's also in the kind of a pragmatic tool of the book that later leads to certain things. But the pragmatism of his character is that's a really good point, and it's a really good thing to point out. But there's also a certain level of sentimentality to him, right? Because he leaves her this fruit and it's quite beautiful. And I think he's also fighting he's fighting against himself in a lot of ways, because I don't think that he can't quite imagine how to get out of this scenario that he's in. And so he physically leaves. And what I had envisioned is that he is presented with more practical opportunities, you know, elsewhere. and it makes more sense for him to stay alive. And he isn't probably sure what he could provide for Mina at that point, and he's unaware of the daughter. Yeah, but that's a really good point regarding the practicality, and then also the women as kind of moving on less. But when you think about it another way of looking at it, though, is that the women do move on. They don't quite move on in the sense where they feel unafraid of men or their relationships with them, but they move on in the sense that they are able to form strong bonds amongst each other. And I always, people kind of, I think, traditionally, we live in a society that kind of looks down upon women like Mina, who, are living month to month, probably, works very hard, but continues to struggle. And yet for me, Mina is a very interestingly successful character. I actually think her owning this small store in a swamp meet is quite heroic and wonderful in a country where it's not easy to have a small business of any kind. And she was a single mother, and sure, she didn't have the best relationship with her daughter, but she managed to raise this young woman who is quite brave and fierce herself and has a lot to learn and can be annoying at times. But at the same time, she's 26 years old. So she has a lot to learn, right? And so in one way, she doesn't quite emotionally move on from the damage that had occurred, but she moves on in other ways that I think are actually quite inspiring and interesting.
Thanks, Ren, for your question. Our next question, and this is projection now. Does Margot ever meet her grandmother, and in your opinion, or move to LA?
That is a question that I get everybody wants to always know. And they'll always say, like, in your mind, it's okay. I mean, we know in our mind what we want, but what did you mean for us to think, And to be honest, I leave the book exactly where I wanted to leave it. It's a kind of way of handing it off to the reader and saying, thank you for being on this journey with me.
I agree with this.
Yeah, thank you for being on this journey with me. Regardless of whether or not she finds her grandmother, I feel like Margot has grown enough just in that single conversation of reaching out to a stranger, speaking a language that she has tried to run away from her whole life. Mm-hmm. She says in Korean, Mina's daughter, you know what I mean, in Korean. So she says in a very elementary way, identifying herself, basically, right? And I feel like there is great power in that action of identifying herself as her mother's daughter, and also reaching out to someone who frighteningly and potentially has the ability to unlock so much information about her. And so whether or not, I think, the optimist of me, of course, wants it to be the grandmother, and of course wants her to like save her money, get to Korea as fast as you can, eat everything you can, buy all the skincare that you can afford, have a blast, So, I'm rooting for her in that sense, but I left the narrative, I left the novel at a very particular point where I felt like it was like time for the reader to kind of take over here.
Yeah, I like that too. And I agree with that. But last night at book club, those were the two questions. They're like, when you talk to her tomorrow,
ask her, I know.
Was just do they, and I didn't even want to bring this one up, but does her and the policeman get together? Do you get that one as well?
I know. So that is also another one. And these questions are great. I love them. So even if you feel like it's like a little embarrassing or like totally. there's sort of like juicy, like, maybe I should ask something about something heavier than this, like on a theme or whatever. It's totally fine. Because we all wonder these things very naturally. I always imagined, and this I also leave up to the reader too, but I always imagined, that this wasn't going to be, if anything happened, maybe there would be some good times. But I had never necessarily envisioned like if this is like a marriage plot or like a romance story or like this is the love of her life, but somebody who provokes her in various ways, and I enjoy that aspect of it. So who knows, maybe maybe there's some fun in Margot's future, but I was not like envisioning a traditional like then they go off to Vegas where her mother was supposed to meet her her father, and they get married at the chapel. But that could be really fun.
Yeah.
So
we have another question. I love participation. Desiree, did you want to ask?
Oh, I think, do we have a hand up or?
Yeah. Here we go.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about your actual writing process when kind of writing two different perspectives and also those jumps in time. Like, how did you kind of organize that?
Desiree, you need more books that are colorful. Holy cow.
Oh my gosh. Is this is that
It's not, it's, I wish it was real. I totally wish it was real. It's not.
I totally thought that was real too. That's awesome. I love it. Yeah. The writing process, two timelines, different perspectives. I'm writing my second book right now, and it's also in a similar format in the sense that it's shifting point of view and it's different timelines as well. And so what is the process for it? People have wondered if I work on one timeline at once and then I weave them later on. I actually really will switch off day by day. It just depends on my mood. For my current book, for The Last Story of Mina, I worked on the timeline somewhat separately, but then I hit points where I feel like, this ties directly into that other timeline. And so I need to go back to that timeline and kind of sew that in a little bit, to make sure that I have a connecting point there. But typically I do work on the two timelines separately. And then later on, at least for the two books that I've either written or I'm working on, I will go back in and sort of rearrange plot line, rearrange sort of sequence of events in order to sort of create flow between the two so that the two are talking with each other. But so for this book, I definitely worked on them separately. I did a lot of heavy revision. I probably revised this book, The Last Story of Mina, maybe somewhere in the 10 to 15 time zones. I definitely revised it a lot. And so there were many iterations of it and many versions of it until I found the right pacing and the right way that I wanted the two timelines to speak with each other. So that's kind of how I organized that work. In terms of actually entering two separate point of views, it's fascinating because we have one woman who is escaping. Both of these women, the book begins with two sort of points of departure for these women. One is Mina, who is running away from this trauma, and Margot, who is running into a trauma, right? Like, it's almost like these 2 points of like where these women's lives change, and then figuring out how these turning points are going to intersect and create a cohesive story. And so when I was thinking about this and sort of creating the feel of both of these two characters, Margot is in a state of dissociation through a lot of the novel. And so we don't get the same amount of, and I think this is partially why people love Mina's chapters, because the quality of the writing is actually slightly different in her chapters. I don't know if people kind of noticed or felt that, where they connected to her on a different level, because she is gone through a major trauma and she is given another chance to be alive, and she's trying to figure out what she's going to do with that now. And so there's like a sensuality to her chapters that is not only in her interactions with Mr. Kim, but also just the way she experiences the world. Like, she has moments that she kind of takes in the geography, and she kind of like goes over memories that are really quite beautiful. While we have Margot, who is kind of operating more on this dissociated post-traumatic state where she's kind of puzzle making and trying to piece together. And so I feel like people, for that reason, it keeps the momentum of the novel going, but the style is very different in a sense that it's less romantic. It's kind of grittier. It's like more like action oriented, more her discovering, more her going out, rather than Mina, who kind of is having a lot of things just sort of happen to her in a way, And so occupying those two spaces is interesting. It could be a little bit jarring, I think, in both reading and writing it. And so I did have to work on those two things separately because they are so different. And then it becomes like a puzzle for me to figure out how I'm gonna work the two together.
Cool.
But it's cool to think about it that way in terms of the different psychological spaces of the two different characters, how they're similar and how they're dissimilar, because Mina isn't trying to like solve anything, right?
Right.
So in some ways, yeah, she's kind of just going through life, and like things are happening and she's responding, while like Margot is being confrontational, you know? And so it can be a little bit jarring as both a reader and a writer, but I feel like it was true to making the story come together.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right.
Thanks, Desiree, for your question. We are running out of time, but I do have a couple more questions that I want to make sure we get to. One, ladies, if you have any other questions, please make sure you put them in the chat window right away. One of them is about the last story of Mina Lee was a Reese Witherspoon pick, and we just need to know what that experience was like.
Yes, it is extraordinary. It feels like because I had, for me in particular, I feel like it was extraordinary because there was not really any anticipation, in my opinion, of my book being, on bestseller lists necessarily. I was working very quietly on this novel for many years. I would have been happy to self-publish this novel eventually. I told myself that, I'm going to work on a novel that matters so much to me. It doesn't really matter if anyone else reads it, but like, I'm going to like print it out myself and then like give it to the people I love and just say, hey, this is that weird thing I was working on for this long, So I had no anticipation of this happening for me or to me, which made it even better because there was, it's not something that I had even necessarily dreamed of because I didn't think it was possible for me. And so, when my book first got picked up, my editor very much saw my book as in the book club space. And that is something that I hadn't necessarily anticipated either, because I felt like I was working on this very kind of complicated mother-daughter story in Koreatown. And I'm like, who would be interested in this? And like, I don't know. I just was just working on this and I felt like I love this so much, but who else is going to love this? Like that's kind of was in my mind. Right. And so when my editor had told me that it had been selected for the club, it was like, I was like, it felt like being like, it was like that Willy Wonka, Charlie, like I had just received this like ticket, and here I was like with like dirt on my face, like sweeping chimneys, just like mopping my floors. And like suddenly, it was kind of a Cinderella moment because, I was just kind of toiling away in my jobs and trying to make writing work. And very few people had read my book outside of my editor and my agent. So I wasn't a person who had exposed my book very much to the world. I had I think 2 or 3 friends read it within that like 9-year period, which is not a lot. No. And so it didn't exist to me outside of myself. And suddenly it became this possibility of like, Reese Witherspoon having read my book and loving it. And so it was really, it's been like an extraordinary experience. The team at Reese's Book Club is so kind and just like, it's so heartfelt. It's so loving. It is so empowering towards women and women's stories. I just think that there's just so much exciting. They're just so good at finding really kind of exciting stories that people want to talk about. I think that's the thing, and so it's been wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
I love that you were like so
Cinderella.
unprepared for like kind of like the response that your book garnered.
Completely unprepared. Yeah, because prior to that, I wasn't like a winner in any way. Like I wasn't one of those people. I know that's hard for people. You're like, what do you mean by that? But like, I was one of those people who like, if you're in the writing world at all, there's all these things we apply to. We apply to like retreats, residencies, fellowships. I was like, there were so many years where I had like 100% rejection rate, Right. So I was like not used to winning anything, not used to having any sort of attention at all. And I had resigned myself to that. I was kind of fine with that, to be honest.
Right.
But, obviously this is great because it makes it easier for me to write the next book. And that's kind of what I'm hungry for. So
Totally. So yeah, the follow-up question is any talk of movie options?
That's a great question. The book has been, I don't know what I can share, but the book has been optioned. So we will see, I mean, this is a very time consuming process, but I really I love to see, this cast. I think it would be phenomenal on the screen. It would be great. I could just, I can totally see it happening,
We've
and so
actually seen a lot of our books, like not our books, but the books that we've read have gone on to, they just seem to be using a lot of books. I don't know.
Well, I think, and it's really fun to see how much they can change it and then create their own thing with the book. And so I'm also excited. I'm also very open and excited to that. I mean, I don't know if all of you watched Little Fires Everywhere on Hulu, which had been changed in so many ways. Yeah, totally. But I think because of the changes became its own like exciting thing that we could talk about and like kind of compare and contrast, like, why did they choose to, I mean, they changed the race of a character, I mean, they made all sorts of bold moves that I actually think are really exciting and provided for like a really good watch. And I enjoyed it. So I'd love for Mina to be on the screen. I just think she's fantastic. I think we would all cry and it would be wonderful to see her in action. Yeah.
So before my last question, I'm just going to ask a question here from Ellen. She says, why didn't Mina's parents look for her? Were they in North Korea?
Oh, yeah, that is, a great question. I think, during this time period, so many families were separated, including my own. There is, it is almost untraceable to a certain extent. Like there are members of my family that my father was separated from his family and they live on, like, he has no idea whether or not they are in North Korea, if they if they made it to South Korea. Like, so many of these families and family members are completely untraceable. And you often assume because of the war that many of them died, and I would assume, I mean, unfortunately, of course, as a mother, I would hold on to the hope that my daughter would be alive, but I would honestly assume that a child could not survive something like that. But many did and actually ended up in orphanages, right? And so I feel like there was a very difficult untraceability, and also possibly, she didn't come from a family with the resources, and so I think that's where Mr. Kim kind of comes in at the end. He uses his resources for good and makes a real difference in these characters' lives.
Very true.
Whether or not we forgive him or we think he's an ass still, they really would have had a good time in Vegas. Really lame, I know.
So my last question for you this evening is, of course, what you're working on next and when can we expect it? And I don't know how much you can tell us about it, but if you can share anything.
Yeah, my book I'm working on right now, I'm kind of in the trenches of it. It's I expect it to be out at the end of 2023, early 2024. So it usually takes about a year out, so it's like you finish a book and then like you've got like a year of like all this like pre-publication stuff, the editing. It's very time consuming. There are some writers who just like pump out books and like, they write one book a year, and it's depends on the style of book that you're writing. The book that I'm writing takes place in Los Angeles, Koreatown again, but it begins with the death of a stranger that is found in a Korean American family's backyard. And there's also a missing mother in this book, and there's a connection between this dead stranger, who is an unhoused man who they think has no tie to their family, but they realize does. Oh. And so it's unpacking what happened to the mother who was missing, and also who is this man and what their relationship was. And so one of the main characters is the father, who is, a Korean American man in his 60s who's worked hard all of his life, but his kids just don't understand him. And he has been pretending that he believes that the wife is dead probably by now, but he knows more than he's letting on. So a lot of secrets here again. That's awesome. It's great. I love working on it, and I'm just grateful. I just want to say how grateful I am to all of you, because by reading my work, it supports me and allows me to write another book, and I'm grateful to readers. It's a book on a bookshelf is like absolutely nothing without readers, you know? And so it's you guys who bring the book and the story to life and to kind of meet it halfway. And so I'm grateful. Thank you.
Well, we look forward to the next book, even though we have to wait a little while. We will, maybe we'll read it again in book club and we'll be able to speak with you once again.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. And I think I see one, I just see one question that I wanted to actually answer really quickly. Somebody asked for recommendations about the Korean War.
Yeah, sorry, I just saw that.
Yeah, I am. Is it Jill? Yeah. So I am actually reading a book right now that I highly recommend. It's called The Evening Hero by Marie Myung-Ok Lee. And I don't know if you've heard of it. There was a review in the Times. It just came out, I believe, in June. And it's heavier in the sense that it is very much a historical novel. But if you're actually interested in the Korean War, like it's very well researched. It's one of those books where, you know, the author took so many years and read so many books to put together. And like, I think that it is so educational from both a Korean and American experience. And it follows the life of a retired OBGYN in the Midwest. And he is kind of going in, it's sort of so it deals with like the privatization of healthcare in America and a sort of McDonald's like aspect of healthcare in America. But then it goes into his history and the family that he left behind in Korea. And so I think it's really fascinating. It can be very heavy at times because there's a lot of war and it can be graphic, but it's beautifully written and very well researched. It's a lot funner and it's funny and it's a lot funner to read than an actual history book if you're interested in the war. So it's called The Evening Hero.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you so much
summer.
for
Thank
your
you
time.
for reading.
And we hope to see you again. Good night,
Thank
ladies.
you. Take care. Bye.